Okay. In our last class, we were talking about the Tughlaq dynasty and we had covered Muhammad bin Tughlaq. तो मोहम्मद बिन तुगलक हमने कवर कर लिया था. नेक्स्ट रूलर फिरोज शाह तुगलक. Now, Muhammad bin Tughlaq had died without leaving any successor, and therefore, after his death, there was a crisis in succession. And the interesting thing was that nobody wanted to accept the crown because the Sultanate was facing a deep crisis and the Tughlaqs were deeply unpopular among all sections of the population: the military, the nobility, the ulema, and the common masses. In this scenario, the name of Firoz Shah Tughlaq was put forward by a section of the nobility because he was a weak and incapable personality without any real administrative experience, and thus they believed that he was easily controllable. Okay? He was one of the cousins of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Now, he had inherited a declining empire. And not simply a declining empire, a rapidly declining empire. There was a major crisis in almost every field. Agriculture was in ruins, and there was a deep unrest among the peasantry who had been overtaxed and exploited during the reign of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. The nobility was also disgruntled with the Tughlaq rule. They had suffered heavily at the hands of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who had adopted a policy of excessive centralization and despotism. The nobility had been marginalized, especially the traditional nobility. In order to diffuse the threat of the traditional Turkish nobility, Muhammad bin Tughlaq had appointed and promoted a number of non-Turkish nobles, especially Hindu nobles. So the nobility was also against the Tughlaq rule. Similarly, the ulema class was also extremely unhappy with the Tughlaqs because Muhammad bin Tughlaq had followed a policy of secularism and even religious pluralism. He had completely sidelined the ulema in all matters of state, and therefore the ulema class wanted to regain their power. Further, the policy of extending direct rule in South India had proven to be a mistake because it had increased the financial burden of the state and had given rise to regional resistance in the south. This had caused a number of revolts against the newly established Sultanate power in the south to erupt, right? This had further exhausted the military power of the Sultan. It had further drained the resources of the Sultanate, and taking advantage of this crisis, a number of ambitious governors in the provinces had also rebelled. For example, Bengal and Sindh were in open rebellion at the time of the accession of Firoz Shah Tughlaq. तो इतना सारा क्राइसिस फेस करने के साथ साथ if unity and integrity had to be maintained, Firoz Shah Tughlaq needed to be a person of immense ability, tactfulness, and skill. However, he lacked all these qualities. He was a weak ruler. He was incapable. And most importantly, he was also a reluctant king. He was unwilling to rule. The crown had been thrust upon him. He had not taken it by his own choice, right? It was a matter of compulsion for him. Would you expect a strong policy from him, proactive measures to safeguard the integrity of the empire, or a weak policy from such a ruler? Weak policy. And thus, Firoz Shah Tughlaq's reign is characterized by the policy of appeasement. Its major objectives were to maintain peace and stability, and to ensure the survival of the Tughlaq dynasty and the Delhi Sultanate. Okay? This policy of appeasement was visible both on the external front as well as the internal front. And who is Firoz Shah Tughlaq going to try and appease? Those people on whom his fate depends. Those groups or those sections who could harm his interests and topple him. Namely, the nobility, the ulema, and the general Muslim population. He also wanted a rapprochement between the crown and the common peasantry who were extremely unhappy under the Tughlaqs. Okay? So, Firoz Shah Tughlaq's rule was characterized by the constant pursuit of legitimacy. He was in a weak position and he was aware of this. Therefore, he wanted to generate support among each and every section of the population in order to ensure his own survival and to prevent any further rebellion or disintegration. Is this clear? तो ये एक इंट्रोडक्शन लिख लीजिए अबाउट फिरोज शाह तुगलक. Firoz Shah Tughlaq was a cousin of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Full stop. After the death of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, Firoz Shah was elevated to the position of Sultan, by a section of the nobility. Full stop. He was, however, reluctant to reluctant, reluctant, reluctant to accept the crown, since the empire was undergoing a deep crisis. Subpoint: the Sultanate had lost much of its territory, during the reign of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. And had been reduced to a small North Indian principality. Full stop. Next subpoint: the disintegration of the Sultanate had not stopped with the loss of the Deccan, with the loss of the Deccan. In fact, powerful rebellions had broken out in Sindh and Bengal, making them virtually independent. Full stop. Next subpoint: agriculture was yet to recover from the disastrous experiments of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. And there was deep unrest among the peasants and local nobility. Next subpoint: the elite Turkish nobility was also disgruntled as they had seen their power, wealth, and prestige be destroyed at the hands of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Next subpoint: similarly, the ulema class was also unhappy with Tughlaq rule due to the secular policy followed by Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Due to the secular policy followed by Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Next main point. This situation called for a capable ruler who could restore peace and stability while ensuring the survival of the Sultanate. Full stop. Subpoint. On the other hand, Firoz Shah Tughlaq was no skilled administrator or capable general. Full stop. He was a weak, incapable, and reluctant king. A weak, incapable, and reluctant king. Full stop. Next subpoint. Therefore, he could not be expected to adopt a proactive policy to arrest the decline of the Sultanate. Full stop. Next subpoint. Instead, he adopted the policy of appeasement. In both the external and internal policy. Next point, its objective was to pacify the unrest within the empire conciliate conciliate the disgruntled sections secure the goodwill of the population and project the legitimacy of the sultan. ठीक है? So this was Firoz Shah Tughlaq's policy of appeasement. Let us see how it manifested in his external and internal policy. Now, the Sultanate in the past 2 decades had lost much of its territory. The whole of South India had been lost, and Bengal and Sindh were also in open rebellion. They had become virtually independent. A strong sultan would have raised a large army, mobilized his forces, and tried to retake these lost territories. Firoz Shah Tughlaq was not going to do this. He was going to pursue the policy of appeasement. And this was a reflection of his own weakness. Very early on in his reign, he came to know his own limitations. 4 campaigns, 4 military expeditions were undertaken by Firoz Shah Tughlaq in the very beginning of his reign itself. The first was against Nagarkot. This was a small Hindu Himalayan kingdom in present-day Himachal Pradesh. It had declared independence during the last years of Muhammad bin Tughlaq's reign, and Firoz Shah Tughlaq was determined to bring it back within the empire. So इसके ऊपर चढ़ाई कर दी. यहाँ पे क्योंकि the enemy was small, he was successful. But still, the fighting was bitter and the campaign was quite long and expensive. ठीक है? His next 2 campaigns came against Bengal. However, in both cases, he was unsuccessful in recovering the territory lost to the governor of Bengal, and Bengal remained independent. And his last campaign came against Sindh, which had been in open rebellion since the last days of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. In fact, Muhammad bin Tughlaq had gone to Sindh at Thatta in 1351, where he died unexpectedly due to illness. ठीक है? तो तब से सिंध rebellion में था. Firoz Shah Tughlaq also decided to go to Sindh. He went there, he raised an army, and he tried to get there through Gujarat and the run of Kutch. However, he and his army could never reach Sindh even. They got lost in the run of Kutch. वहीं पे गोल गोल घूमने लग गए. Firoz Shah Tughlaq finally had to be rescued by his prime minister Khan Jahan Maqbool. Therefore, the expedition to Sindh could not even materialize. And the writing was on the wall for all to see that Firoz Shah Tughlaq's reign is not going to be characterized by great conquests like Alauddin Khilji or Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Firoz Shah Tughlaq could also see this, and therefore he declared that he was from now on going to follow a peaceful policy. He publicly resolved to abandon war by saying that he did not wish to shed the blood of innocent Muslims for gaining territory. Since it is prohibited in Islam. ठीक है? A Muslim should not kill another Muslim. A Muslim ruler should not attack another Muslim ruler simply for gaining territory. ठीक है? Now, was this policy of pacifism a reflection of his religious views or his own military limitations? Reason क्या था actually? Because he was a Pakka Muslim, he adopted this policy, or was it that he knew that he was never going to succeed? He was never going to succeed. तो इसको पता था कि मिलिट्री फील्ड में कोई अचीवमेंट नहीं कर सकता है, so it is better to have a graceful exit. And this was the reason for his policy of pacifism. ठीक है? Write down. In the early part of his reign, Firoz Shah Tughlaq undertook 4 military campaigns. After which he adopted a policy of pacifism, and abandoned war. Full stop. These were number 1, Nagarkot, a small Himalayan Hindu kingdom in modern Himachal Pradesh, which had declared independence was successfully suppressed and its ruler was forced to pay tribute. Full stop. However, the campaign was long and expensive. With the Sultanate army facing many problems and taking heavy losses. Next, number 2. Bengal had become virtually independent had become virtually independent. And Firoz Shah tried to recover it twice. Full stop. But he had to return empty handed. He had to return empty handed on both occasions. Number 3, Sindh. Had been in open rebellion, had been in open rebellion since the days of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Full stop. Therefore, Firoz Shah Tughlaq decided to invade it and began marching towards Sindh, via Gujarat with a large army. Full stop. However, the invasion could never even materialize. The invasion could never even materialize, as the Sultan lost his way in the run of Kutch. Lost his way in the run of Kutch and had to be rescued by his Prime Minister Khan-e-Jahan Maqbool. Khan-e-Jahan Maqbool. He was also known as Khan-e-Jahan Telangani. ठीक है? Khan-e-Jahan Maqbool. Next main point लिखो. Following this, Firoz Shah Tughlaq realized his limitations as a military commander. And thus publicly abandoned the policy of war. Full stop. He declared that he did not wish to shed the blood of innocent Muslims, for gaining territory. Since it is prohibited under Islam. Full stop. Next point. However, most historians believe that his pacifism was not really the result of his religious outlook. Rather, it was due to his military weakness. Okay? Now, in ancient India, even Ashoka had adopted the policy of pacifism. He had abandoned the policy of war, Dheri Ghosh, and adopted the policy of Dhamma Ghosh, victory of hearts and minds. In that case and this case, major difference kya tha? Ashoka had adopted the policy of pacifism as a matter of choice. For Firoz Shah Tughlaq, it was a matter of compulsion. It was a reflection of his weakness. Okay? For Ashoka, it was a reflection of his strength. Clear? तो ये हो गया एक्सटर्नल पॉलिसी में पैसिफिज्म. Oh, sorry, appeasement. This policy of appeasement was also visible in his internal or domestic policy. First of all, the adventurous experiments of Muhammad bin Tughlaq in the field of agriculture had completely destroyed the agriculture. It had also destroyed the state revenues that it was deriving from agriculture. Therefore, a number of revenue reforms were initiated by Firoz Shah Tughlaq in order to revive agriculture and restore the goodwill of the peasants. He wanted to bring the burden of taxation down. He wanted to encourage agriculture. He wanted to raise or expand the agriculture and thus revive the state income. Secondly, a number of agrarian reforms were also introduced by him with the same objectives. Thirdly, changes were made to the legal judicial system in order to make the penal code milder and fairer. In order to repair the breach in the relationship between the Sultan and the nobility, he also introduced some administrative reforms. Further, in order to secure the goodwill of the general population, especially the Muslims, he initiated a number of welfare policies in order to provide them relief, to rehabilitate them, to improve their qualities of life. Furthermore, the policy of appeasement was also visible in Firoz Shah Tughlaq's public works. Now, the economy was in ruins, unemployment and poverty were high, starvation was a major threat, and scarcity was another problem. In order to provide some respite against this, Firoz Shah Tughlaq undertook a grand project of creating infrastructure, building cities, forts, a number of monuments in order to provide infrastructure to revive trade and at the same time employment to the people. The policy of appeasement was also visible in his religious policy. He wanted to repair the relationship between the ulema and the crown. Changes were also introduced in the field of the military in order to secure the support of the common soldier and military commanders. And finally, in order to gain greater legitimacy as a true cultural ruler, he also promoted or patronized education and literature along with the arts. ठीक है, कैसे कैसे किया ये? Let us take a look. Take down a few introductory remarks. The policy of appeasement was also adopted on the domestic front. To restore normalcy and stability. Number one, normalcy and stability. Number one, revenue reforms. Now, problem with the revenue policy of Muhammad bin Tughlaq kya tha? The excessively heavy burden of taxation on the peasants. It was unsustainable. In order to reduce this so that farmers would have an incentive to revive agriculture, Firoz Shah Tughlaq got a detailed survey of the entire farmland in the Sultanate. His Prime Minister Khan Jahan Maqbool had carried out this survey, right? Purpose क्या था इस सर्वे का? So that the annual income of the state could be assessed and fixed permanently. ठीक है, तो पूरे के पूरे एग्रीकल्चरल लैंड का सर्वे किया एंड द annual state income that was permanently fixed at a sum of 6.5 crore tankas. What was the result of this? क्या फायदे होंगे इसके? दो फायदे. First of all, the state is going to be assured of receiving this sum each and every year, right? So the problem of fluctuating revenue could be eliminated. Secondly, by fixing the notional state income, उसके ऊपर एक cap लगा दिया गया that at any given point in the future, this is going to be the maximum amount that the state is going to earn from agricultural revenue, right? And this incentivized the expansion of agriculture. So if the farmer was able to make improvements to his farm or bring new land under the plow, the extra income that he generated, he would be able to keep all of it. He would not have to pay the extra income or any extra tax to the state. तो उसके फायदे में है अपने फार्म में और ज्यादा इन्वेस्टमेंट करना और ज्यादा फार्म लैंड को एक्सपैंड करना, राइट? सो दिस वाज वन थिंग दैट वाज डन बाय हिम. लिख लीजिए इसको. ये लिख लिया है? लिख लिया? चलो. नेक्स्ट थिंग दैट ही डिड in the field of revenue administration, he abolished all the non-Shariat taxes and aligned the tax regime with the Sharia, right? तो Sharia क्या होता है? It is law. Arabic word है, it means law. Shariat law is a term used to denote Islamic law. Now, under the Sharia system, there are 5 prescribed taxes, such as kharaj, ushr, khums, jizya, and zakat. Kharaj is land revenue collected from non-Muslims. The prescribed rate in the Kitabul Kharaj is 33% of the total produce, or 1/3 of the total produce. Ushr is land revenue that is supposed to be paid by Muslims, with the prescribed rate being 10% of the total produce. Khums is the state's share in war booty. The prescribed rate is 1/5 of the total loot. It should go to the state, to the sultan. The remainder should be distributed among the soldiers. Jizya was originally introduced as the protection tax. Okay. Now, in the early years of Islamic conquest, as new lands came under Islamic rule, जहां पे पहले इस्लाम नहीं होता था, this had led to the division of the society into Muslims and non-Muslims. The Muslims were called the millat. That means the faithful community. And only members of the millat had the right to fight. Okay? So only they could provide military service. Non-Muslims were known as dhimmis or zimmis. Which literally meant the protected class, since they could not fight. Okay? They could not provide military service. So they were always dependent on the millat for their defense. And अब ये zimmis का responsibility क्या होगा? They would need to support the millat in their own defense. They would have to pay for their own defense. Therefore, jizya was introduced as a protection tax paid by which of these groups? Non-Muslims, the zimmis or dhimmis. But with the passage of time, as Islamic rule was consolidated, the definition of jizya, its function had changed. Now it became a tool of religious discrimination and proselytization. Okay? The Islamic rulers and the ulama class started imposing jizya on non-Muslims in order to create a stigma against their non-Muslim and subordinate status. They wanted to humiliate the non-Muslim population. They wanted to pressurize them economically and force them to convert to Islam in order to escape this jizya. Originally, ये जो जिजिया होता था, that used to go to the military, right? But now, since it is a tool of religious propagation and discrimination, it was going to the ulama class. Okay? Its purpose was changed to promote Islam. And from being a protection tax, it had now been transformed into a poll tax collected from non-Muslims. A poll tax is any tax that a group has to pay simply because of their identity. ठीक है? तो फॉर एग्जाम्पल कि किसी की सरकार आती है एंड दे डोंट लाइक अ पर्टिकुलर ग्रुप ऑफ पीपल, मान लो टीवी के एक्टर, राइट? वो ये बोल सकते हैं कि टीवी के एक्टर्स को ये टैक्स एक्स्ट्रा देना पड़ेगा. दैट इज अ पोल टैक्स. ठीक है? Now, its rate depended on the level of income of each individual, but traditionally some groups were exempt. कौन से groups? Women were exempted, children were exempted, disabled people were exempted, beggars and destitutes were exempted, those people who were suffering from a famine, they were exempted, and some scholars were exempted, priests were exempted. In India, Brahmins had been exempted. ठीक है? And zakat was a donation towards charity made by Muslims. Now, it also depended on the income of every individual and was voluntary. Generally, those in a position to pay gave 2 to 3% of their annual income as charity. ठीक है? It was seen as a work of religious merit. तो zakat दो तो पुण्य मिलेगा, right? सवाब मिलेगा. That was the idea. Now, Alauddin Khilji had introduced a number of non-Shariat taxes, ghari, charai, etc. Muhammad bin Tughlaq had also continued them. Firoz Shah Tughlaq क्या करेगा? He abolished all the non-Shariat taxes. Barney mentions 21 such non-Shariat taxes that were abolished by Firoz Shah Tughlaq. And in its place, he introduced the 5 Shariat taxes as prescribed in the Kitabul Kharaj. Is this much clear? Sure. Now, all these taxes were applied in the correct proportions. तो खराज का जो rate था, earlier that used to be 50%, now it was reduced to 33%. The land revenue on Muslims was brought down to 10%. Jizya was also imposed, and while earlier Brahmins were exempted, Firoz Shah Tughlaq also imposed it on Brahmins as well. Clear? So apart from the general non-Muslim population, Brahmins also had to pay. तो एक ये change किया इसने in the revenue administration. क्या? कि पहले इसका पर्पस अलग होता था. It used to be a protection tax, but with the consolidation of Islamic power, the priority became the promotion of Islam itself, right? And therefore, jizya को बना दिया गया अब एक tool of religious discrimination and proselytization. Proselytization means the propagation of religion. अपने धर्म को फैलाना, ठीक है? लोगों को convert करने के लिए encourage करना. All right. So it became a poll tax now. Is this clear? What was the effect of all of these? Write down. According to Barney, these revenue reforms proved highly successful. Full stop. Agriculture flourished and farmers became prosperous. Full stop. There was no shortage or famine. Full stop. The state revenue stabilized and the imperial treasury was refilled. ठीक है? तो ये हो गए रेवेन्यू रिफॉर्म्स. क्या क्या किया है? First of all, the alignment of the Sultanate's taxation regime with the Shariat, and secondly, fixing the agricultural income of the state to the sum of 6.5 crore tankas, thus eliminating the problem of fluctuating revenues and incentivizing the improvement and expansion of agriculture. Result क्या हुआ है? Overall growth, prosperity and economic recovery. Second, कौन से set of reforms? The agricultural reforms. ठीक है? Now, in the field of agricultural reform, what was the major step taken by Muhammad bin Tughlaq? मॉडल एग्रीकल्चरल फार्म बनाया था, एक बड़ा सा फार्म बनाया था, where he asked the displaced peasants to come and set up their own farms, introduce agriculture. That had failed. Now, Firoz Shah Tughlaq recognized that the idea itself was not bad, but where the Sultan, his predecessor failed was in its implementation. The mistake probably was trusting the officials of the Diwan-e-Amir ko hi and not having proper oversight. Another mistake may have been that instead of trusting distressed farmers to prioritize expansion of agriculture over their basic survival, that was also a mistake. तो इससे अच्छा strategy क्या होगा? जो already well established farmers हैं, who have all the necessary means to undertake expansion, they should be encouraged. So in place of a single large farm, a number of small experimental farms should be introduced. Okay? That is what he did. Write down. Small experimental farms were set up around Delhi, and farmers were encouraged to expand agriculture, comma, improve their farms and cultivate superior crops with state assistance. ठीक है? क्लियर? तो अब पैडी की जगह पे राइस प्लांट करें, मिलेट्स की जगह पे wheat plant करें, this kind of thing. The state also gave soft loans to the individual farmers in order to dig wells, construct farmsteads, houses, etc. ठीक है? तो ये सारे काम अब करने शुरू हुए. तो it was highly successful. Next point लिखो. Firoz Shah Tughlaq also laid down 1,200 gardens and orchards around Delhi. 1,200 gardens and orchards around Delhi. Generating a sizable income of 1.8 lakh tankas annually. ठीक है? So one step was also taken towards the promotion of horticulture. Next point लिखो. Firoz Shah also understood that peasant discontent was not being caused only due to heavy taxation, but also due to their indebtedness to the state. Their indebtedness to the state. Indebtedness. Indebtedness to the state. So, you remember Muhammad bin Tughlaq had started giving the Gavi loans to farmers in distress, right? Now a period khatam ho chuka tha, the loan had matured and they had to begin repayment, right? However, the farmers were not in a position to do so. वैसे में फिरोज शाह तुगलक ने क्या किया? In order to ensure their support, he simply wrote off these Tagavi loans. ये लोन जो है माफ कर दिए. Write down. Therefore, he wrote off all the Tagavi loans made to farmers during the reign of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. During the reign of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Okay? अच्छा. इसके अलावा in order to promote agriculture, Firoz Shah Tughlaq also undertook the project of building canals. Okay? So 5 major canals which were known as Rajwahas were constructed around Delhi. Now, this provided artificial irrigation to the fertile region of Punjab, Haryana, and western Uttar Pradesh. And this led to the expansion and growth of agriculture also. Write down. To encourage the growth of agriculture, Firoz Shah Tughlaq constructed a network of 5 major canals around Delhi. Two of these canals were drawing water from the Yamuna, and one each from the Ghaggar, Satluj, and Kali Sindh. Write down. Around Delhi, full stop. Two of them were on the Yamuna, and one each on the Ghaggar, Satluj, and Kali Sindh. Ghaggar, Satluj, and Kali Sindh. Okay. Now, The construction and maintenance of these canals had taken considerable funds, and how was the state going to pay for this? किसको टैक्स करना चाहिए? सबको टैक्स करना चाहिए? ओनली दोज हु वुड बेनिफिट फ्रॉम दिस, जिसको फायदा मिलेगा उसको टैक्स करना चाहिए. And therefore, a new irrigation tax known as the Haq a Sharb of 10% of the total yield was introduced for those farmers who were drawing water from one of these canals. Okay, write down. An irrigation tax of 10% known as Haq a Sharb was also introduced. ठीक है, हक ए शर्ब. What was the impact of these agricultural reforms? Small farms, orchards, gardens, construction of canals. इस सब का फायदा क्या हुआ? Agriculture grew steadily. There was no shortage, and even the poor people could consume rich and nutritious food. This is as reported by Barney. Write down. Due to these reforms, agriculture revived quickly. Ending shortage, famine, and unrest. Famine and unrest. According to Barney, the prices of food grains, vegetables, and fruits were low. And even the poor could afford a nutritious diet. ठीक है, ये हो गए agricultural reforms. Next, the judicial reforms. बताइए क्या किया इसने? राइट डाउन. The penal system was reformed to make it milder and more humane. Full stop. Punishments such as torture, and amputations were abolished. Punishments such as torture and amputations were abolished. Full stop. Further, improvements were made in the general conditions of prisons. Right? इसके पहले क्या करते थे? काल कोठरी में बंद कर देते थे. Solitary confinement in dank, dark, humid, closed, confined spaces for extensive periods. The prisoners were kept isolated. Right? Now more humane conditions. थोड़ा लाइट मिलना चाहिए, थोड़ा एक्सरसाइज मिलना चाहिए. ये सारी चीजें इंट्रोड्यूस करी गई. ठीक है, तो एक ये चेंज किया. नेक्स्ट, एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव रिफॉर्म्स. What do we find? Administrative reforms. Write down. Firoz Shah Tughlaq wanted to repair the relationship with the traditional Turkish nobility. With the traditional Turkish nobility. Therefore, he undid the administrative reforms of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Full stop. A number of Hindu officials were dismissed and in their place members of the Muslim aristocracy were appointed. Muslim aristocracy were appointed. Next point. The autonomy of provincial governors was restored. And the position of Waliul Kharaj was abolished. ठीक है, वलीउल खराज इंट्रोड्यूस किया था मोहम्मद बिन तुगलक ने in order to introduce the element of checks and balances, separation of powers in provincial government. Now this position was abolished, and both the revenue and administrative powers were now once again conjoined in the office of the wali or mukti, the provincial governor. Next point likho. To appease the nobility, iktas were made hereditary. Iktas were made hereditary. ठीक है. Next main point. In this way, the feudal ambitions of the nobility were fulfilled. And the traditional Turkish nobility largely remained favorable towards the Sultan. Largely remained favorable towards the Sultan. Next, remained favorable towards the Sultan. Next, his welfare initiatives. Write down. Firoz Shah Tughlaq wanted to gain the goodwill of the common population and be seen as their legitimate ruler. Thus, he adopted a populist welfare policy. The major initiatives were as follows. Number one, establishing the Diwan-e-Ishtiyaq to provide relief to those who had suffered during Muhammad bin Tughlaq's reign. Number two, establishing the Diwan-e-Khairat to provide financial assistance to poor Muslim families to marry off their daughters. Number three, establishing the Diwan-e-Bandagan to look after the welfare of slaves. To look after the welfare of slaves. Number four, establishing infirmaries and hospitals known as Dawakhana or Shifa Khana to treat the sick free of cost. Next, setting up free kitchens to feed the poor. Verse 6, setting up sarais, digging wells, and planting trees along important trade routes to ensure the welfare of travelers. To ensure the welfare of travelers. Okay. Now, with this, he did not only want to win the support of the common people, he also wanted to get the approval of the ulemas. Now, this was not a free for all. Firoz Shah Tughlaq adopted a biased religious policy. Therefore, most of these initiatives were available only to Muslims, not to non-Muslims. So, write down. Through these welfare initiatives, Firoz Shah also wanted to secure the approval of the ulema class. Thus, most of these were available only to Muslims. ठीक है? Next, कितने 4 हुए ना? 5. The 6th, public works. Write down. Firoz Shah Tughlaq is remembered as the greatest builder. Of the Sultanate period. Full stop. His contribution to this field should also be viewed VIEWED, viewed from the lens of appeasement. Full stop. Next point. The empire was facing an economic crisis with low production, commerce, and demand. Full stop. Poverty and unemployment were extremely high, and a quick solution was needed. Full stop. Was needed. Next point. Firoz Shah undertook the construction of public infrastructure at a grand scale to revive trade, generate employment, and create demand. क्या क्या बनाया इसने? First of all, he constructed 5 cities. Firoz Shah Tughlaq, Firozabad, Jaunpur, Fatehabad, and Hisar Firoza. Firoz Shah Tughlaq कहाँ? In Delhi. Firozabad and Jaunpur in UP. Fatehabad and Hisar Firoza in Haryana. Next point. He also constructed a network of 5 canals around Delhi. He also repaired and expanded earlier monuments such as the Qutub Minar, the Hauz-e-Shamsi, and the Hauz-e-Alai, also known as Hauz Khas. हौज का मतलब होता है टैंक और रिजर्वायर. Hauz-e-Shamsi had been constructed during the reign of Iltutmish, Hauz-e-Alai during the reign of Alauddin Khilji. Okay, तो देखो अभी पावर कट हो गया था, सॉरी अबाउट दैट. We were talking about the public works of Firoz Shah Tughlaq. So 5 cities he constructed, a network of 5 canals were also constructed by him. Apart from this, a number of old monuments were repaired by him. इसके आगे एक और चीज आप लिख सकते हैं, that Firoz Shah also transported two Ashokan pillars to Delhi. One he brought from Meerut and the other he brought from Topara. Meerut in UP, Topara in Haryana. And he installed them. इसी में ही next main point लिखो. Firoz Shah Tughlaq also brought two Ashokan pillars to Delhi from Meerut and Topara. Full stop. Next point. He also introduced the ta se ghadiyal. That is the clock tower. Right? और कौन सा मैकेनिज्म यूज होता था इस क्लॉक टावर में? वाटर क्लॉक टावर विद अ वाटर क्लॉक. तो घड़ियाल घड़े से आता है and a small hole used to be bored into the bottom of a pot, an earthen pot, and it was placed in an urn of water, in a utensil of water, and the pot was then allowed to float on it. Slowly water is going to start entering the pot. Now the water is going to enter the pot through that same hole at a constant speed, and thus the pot is going to continue sinking, and you can measure time by how much of the pot has already sunk. So ta se ghadiyal yahan pe introduce kiya gaya tha. Next point. He also constructed an astronomical observatory known as Utsarlabh. Apart from this, his reign witnessed the construction of numerous sarais, palaces, bridges, forts, tombs, mosques, madrasas, gardens, and pleasure resorts. ठीक है? So these were his public works. Number 7. Military policy. In order to appease commanders and soldiers, comma, क्या करेगा ये? डिसिप्लिन को और स्ट्रिक्ट करेगा या रिलैक्स कर देगा? ही रिलैक्स्ड द discipline of the army. The practices of Dag, Pulia, and surprise inspections were abandoned. ठीक है? Were abandoned. Next point. Military positions earlier used to be given on the basis of merit were now made hereditary. Payment to soldiers through cash salaries was abandoned, and the practice of assigning them iktas was revived. ठीक है? So military is going to become more and more decentralized. It is going to become more and more feudal. As a write down next main point. As a result, the Sultanate military was transformed into a decentralized feudal institution. Due to the relaxation of discipline and encouragement of corruption, do you think it remained an effective fighting force capable of conquest and active defense of the territory? No, the fighting capabilities were significantly degraded. Write down further, comma, military effectiveness was severely downgraded. एंड लॉन्ग टर्म में ये फायदेमंद होगा या नुकसानदेह? नुकसान करेगा. एंड इट प्रूव्ड to be a major factor in accelerating the decline of the Delhi Sultanate. Number 8. Religious policy. Barney, in his second book, the Fatwa-e-Jahandari, which is a work on the art of statecraft, that is, how the different organs of the state should be organized, how they should be interlinked, how they should function, what are the objectives of the state, what should be the qualities of the ruler, his ministers, his officials, etc. ये सारी चीजों के बारे में बात करी है. In this book, Barney has discussed the concept of the ideal Muslim king, and while judging Firoz Shah Tughlaq, he has said that Firoz Shah Tughlaq had all the qualities of an ideal Muslim king. तो फिरोज शाह तुगलक को उसने बोल दिया है he was an ideal Muslim king. ठीक है, and that was primarily because of Firoz Shah Tughlaq's religious policy. Clear? Write down. Barney in the Fatwa-e-Jahandari has described Firoz Shah Tughlaq as the ideal Muslim king. As the ideal Muslim king. As the ideal Muslim king. Full stop. This was due to the following factors. Number one, Firoz Shah Tughlaq treated the ulemas with utmost respect. With utmost respect. And the ulema enjoyed a great degree of influence in politics. In politics. Number two, under the influence of the ulema, Firoz Shah Tughlaq made sincere efforts to align his government with the principles of Shariat. एग्जाम्पल कहीं पे दिखा है ये अटेम्प्ट अलाइनमेंट ऑफ द स्टेट पॉलिसी विद शरीयत. एग्जाम्पल द taxation policy where Firoz Shah abolished 21 non-Shariat taxes and introduced the 5 prescribed Shariat taxes in the correct proportion, in the correct order. ठीक है. Next point. Firoz Shah Tughlaq also made every attempt to use the state machinery to promote Islam. कैसे? First of all, Muslims were treated as the privileged class, wherein the burden of taxes on them were lower. They were also given preference in matters of employment. They were also rewarded with a number of exclusive welfare initiatives. Patronage by the state was also reserved for Muslim scholars, schools, and artists almost exclusively. ठीक है? Further, the non-Muslims were pressurized constantly by the state machinery to convert. Constantly by the state machinery to convert to instruments such as jizya, which was even imposed on Brahmins for the first time, comma, forcible conversions, and destruction of temples even in peacetime. ठीक है? Discrimination against non-Muslims in the field of employment, trade, and the justice system. Okay? So if there is a criminal case in which there are two opposing witnesses, one is a Hindu, one is a Muslim, judge किसको सुनेगा, काजी किसको सुनेगा, Muslim को. The testimony of the Hindu witness is going to be less valuable in the eyes of the Islamic Shariat than the testimony of a Muslim witness. इस तरह के legal discrimination. There was no legal or economic equality. They were being persecuted. In fact, persecution reached a new level as Firoz Shah Tughlaq infamously burnt a Brahmin priest alive for trying to convert a Muslim woman to Hinduism. Okay? So religious freedom was completely suppressed. Firoz Shah Tughlaq even burnt a Brahmin priest alive for trying to convert a Muslim woman to Hinduism. Okay? So state machinery was also being used by Firoz Shah Tughlaq to promote Islam with any means necessary through inducement as well as fear and persecution. Right? Next, number 4. Firoz Shah Tughlaq also promoted Islamic learning and culture by constructing numerous madrasas and mosques First of Islamic religious institutions received generous donations as well. Number 5, the Sultan adopted a policy of pacifism towards Muslim states since Islam prohibited the killing of Muslims for territorial gain. Okay? Next, number 6. Firoz Shah Tughlaq maintained extremely friendly relations with the Caliph. Extremely friendly relations with the Caliph. In fact, he was the only Sultan of Delhi to receive the Caliph's Mansur, that is, letter of investiture, twice. Okay? All the other sultans applied for the Caliph's recognition once, and the Caliph recognized their rule as legitimate. Firoz Shah Tughlaq applied for it twice, and twice the Caliph confirmed him as the legitimate Sultan of Delhi. Okay? Now, because of all these things, that Firoz Shah Tughlaq involved the ulama in matters of state policy. They had an influential role within the state. He tried to align the state and its policies with the Shariat law, that he used the state machinery to promote Islam, both through positive as well as negative means, through inducement as well as pressure. He also promoted Islamic learning and culture. He adopted a policy of pacifism as prescribed by Islam towards other Muslims, and he maintained extremely friendly relations with the Caliph and described himself as the right hand of the Caliph, as the deputy of the Caliph. Because of all these things, Barni has described him as the ideal Muslim king. Next main point likho. However, upon closer observation, a different reality emerges. A different reality emerges. Full stop. Many of the sultans policies and personal habits were in violation of the Sharia. Were in violation of the Sharia. ठीक है? किस तरह की पॉलिसीज? Number 1, while Firoz Shah Tughlaq did abolish several non-Shariat taxes, he also introduced one non-Shariat tax, that is the Haq-e-Sharb. Nowhere is it mentioned in the Kitabul Kharaj. So write down. He introduced a non-Shariat tax, known as the Haq-e-Sharb. A non-Shariat tax known as the Haq-e-Sharb. Number 2, देखो, he also distorted the traditional Shariat law, by see, under the traditional Shariat law, women have the right to inherit property. But in India, this right was never given to women, even under Islamic law. So he made no attempt to correct this practice and bring the inheritance law in line with Shariat. So अभी क्या लिखा है आपने? Distorted the Shariat law by keeping women away from the right to inheritance. Number 3, further distortion of the criminal code of the Shariat law. क्या? See, Shariat law में drinking, gambling, ये सारी चीजों की इजाजत नहीं होती. These are all seen as illegal activities. However, the criminal code the legal code of Firoz Shah Tughlaq and the Delhi Sultanate as a whole always gave permission for these activities. They were considered legal. Write down. Further, practices such as gambling, drinking, and prostitution were not prohibited in accordance with Shariat. Number 4. In fact, the Sultan himself was addicted to alcohol. Now, how many maximum number of wives can a man have under Islamic Shariat? 4 मैक्सिमम हो सकती हैं, राइट? फिरोज शाह तुगलक की कई सारी थी, तो राइट डाउन. फर्दर, in violation of Shariat, which allows a man to have a maximum of 4 wives, Firoz Shah Tughlaq had maximum of 4 wives. Firoz Shah Tughlaq has had several times as many. Next point, number 6. While writing off the Takawi loans, no discrimination was done between Muslim and non-Muslim peasants. Between Muslims and non-Muslim peasants. What would an ideal Muslim king have done? He would have written off the loans for Muslim peasants, but he would have forced the Hindu peasants to pay the full amount. Right? Therefore, next point likho. Therefore, not number 8. Next main point. Therefore, modern historians have challenged Bernie's estimate of Firoz Shah Tughlaq as an ideal Muslim ruler. Full stop. While Firoz Shah Tughlaq definitely had a bigoted religious policy, comma, it is important to understand the factors for such a policy. The factors for such a policy. According to Burney, the most important factor was the personal religious convictions of the Sultan, right? He believed that it was his duty as a Muslim ruler to follow a bigoted, a discriminatory religious policy. Now, modern historians concede that while in his personal convictions, Firoz Shah Tughlaq was a pious and committed Muslim, they reject the idea that in the matter of religious policy, Firoz Shah Tughlaq was acting independently. To reject the idea of autonomy in his religious policy. Rather, they point to other factors. According to modern historians, when it came to following a bigoted religious policy, Firoz Shah Tughlaq faced a number of political compulsions. He was a weak ruler who depended upon the support of the ulema class. Okay? Therefore, it was his objective to constantly appease the ulema class to secure their approval. And his bigoted religious policy was primarily the result of his desire to appease and seek the approval of the ulemas. Further, he had to work extra hard. The ulemas did not trust him in the beginning, at least, for two reasons. So the ulemas lacked trust in Firoz Shah Tughlaq initially, first of all, because of the activities of his predecessor, Muhammad bin Tughlaq. In fact, the bulk of the ulema class was in favor of abolishing the Tughlaq dynasty and introducing a new one, right? So they had a bitter experience with Muhammad bin Tughlaq. And secondly, Firoz Shah Tughlaq himself was a suspect figure. Although he was a religious scholar, he himself had a Hindu mother. His mother was a Bhati Rajput princess from Deepalpur, and therefore he was not trusted by the ulemas initially. Therefore, he had to prove himself in the eyes of the ulema, and hence there was a great sense of urgency in his desire to appease the ulemas, which resulted in an extremely bigoted religious policy. Right? So, modern historians जो हैं वो इन ऑब्जेक्टिव मटेरियल फैक्टर्स को कंसिडर करते हैं, एंड इन दिस लाइट द आर्ग्यूमेंट दैट फिरोज शाह तुगलक वाज सम सॉर्ट ऑफ आइडियल मुस्लिम किंग दैट बिकम्स इवन वीकर. ठीक है, राइट डाउन नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट. इन लाइट ऑफ these circumstances, the argument that Firoz Shah Tughlaq was an ideal Muslim king becomes even weaker. ठीक है. एंड डोमेस्टिक पॉलिसी में लास्ट चीज पेट्रनेज. टू एजुकेशन and art. Why education and art? Why would a ruler try to promote education and art? It is very good PR. ठीक है, तो पब्लिसिटी बड़ी अच्छी मिलती है कि देखो अच्छे काम करवा रहा है बंदा. He is the legitimate ruler. So write down. Firoz Shah Tughlaq sought legitimacy by promoting learning and art. In order to appear as a great patron of Islamic culture. Full stop. Next point. He provided patronage to a number of Islamic scholars, such as Barni and Afif. Next point. He also was a gifted scholar himself. And was the only sultan to write an autobiography. Known as the Futuhat-e-Firoz Shahi. Next point. He was also a skilled musician. And during his reign, Hindustani music was heavily patronized. Next point. He also made a grand contribution to the fields of musical, medical, and philosophical knowledge or learning by having roughly 1200 ancient Sanskrit texts, 1200 ancient Sanskrit texts on these subjects translated into Persian and compiled into 3 works. Rag Darpan. This is a treatise on music. Tib-e Firoz Shahi. This is a treatise on medicine. And the Dalil-e Firoz Shahi. This is a work of philosophy. ठीक है? और ये 1200 एंशिएंट संस्कृत टेक्स्ट इसको मिले कहां से थे? You remember in the beginning of his reign he had attacked Nagarkot. Over there was a famous temple known as the Jwalamukhi temple that was destroyed. Its library was looted, and from that library these 1200 Sanskrit texts were brought to Delhi and translated later on. Okay, so this was the career of Firoz Shah Tughlaq. Take down a question. Analyze the contributions of Firoz Shah Tughlaq in securing the integrity and ensuring the survival of the Delhi Sultanate. Full stop. 200 words, 15 marks. Next question. In your view, was Firoz Shah Tughlaq really an ideal Muslim king? फुल स्टॉप, सॉरी क्वेश्चन मार्क, 200 वर्ड्स 15 मार्क्स। ये दोनों क्वेश्चंस हो जाने चाहिए। I don't think there would be any problem. Contributions of securing the integrity and ensuring the survival of the Delhi Sultanate. We are going to have to talk about primarily the policy of appeasement by contextualizing it, by talking about the crisis that the Sultanate faced in the beginning of his reign. Okay? So for that, because of that, he was compelled to follow the policy of appeasement. कोई और रास्ता नहीं था उसके पास। थर्ड क्वेश्चन, to what extent was Firoz Shah Tughlaq responsible for the disintegration of the Delhi Sultanate? $200 words, 15 marks. Right? तो ये वाला जो है सवाल कल के डिस्कशन के बाद क्लियर हो जाएगा। Next topic we have to discuss is the role of Firoz Shah Tughlaq in the decline of the Delhi Sultanate. I'm going to end this class now. अगर कोई doubts हैं तो please go ahead and ask me. हाँ, उसको कंसाइज करना पड़ेगा, बट यू हैव टू इंक्लूड ऑल ऑफ दिस, राइट? कुछ चीजें को आप ज्यादा स्पेस दे सकते हो, कुछ चीजों को आप कम स्पेस दोगे। पूछा है ना, इन योर व्यू वाज फिरोज शाह तुगलक एन आइडियल मुस्लिम किंग, यस और नो? तो वो बताना होगा यहाँ पे। यू हैव टू टॉक अबाउट द रिलीजियस पॉलिसी ओनली। ओके, ऐसे ही किसी भी एक पॉलिसी के ऊपर आ सकता है। चांसेस आर कि या तो पॉलिसी ऑफ अपीजमेंट के ऊपर आएगा, या रिलीजियस पॉलिसी के ऊपर आएगा, या फिर रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी इन डिक्लाइन ऑफ द सल्तनत। तीनों क्वेश्चन हम यहाँ पे एड्रेस करेंगे। थर्ड वाला भी करना है हमको, ठीक है? तो नेक्स्ट क्लास में करेंगे। ऑनलाइन स्टूडेंट्स, कोई डाउट्स हैं? नो? Bakhtiyar Khilji was an early Turkish general. So he came with the army of Ghori. He was a general of Ghori, and he was responsible for the conquest of Eastern India. तो ईस्टर्न यूपी से लेकर के बंगाल के कॉन्क्वेस्ट के लिए वो रिस्पॉन्सिबल है। तो 1194 में शायद उसने ये किया था, हाँ, राइट आफ्टर द बैटल ऑफ चंदावर 1194 में, विद इन अ फ्यू शॉर्ट मंथ्स द होल ऑफ ईस्टर्न इंडिया वाज अंडर टर्किश कंट्रोल। तो वहां पे रोल है। After that, he is not very significant. He is नहीं, he destroyed some universities, विक्रमशिला, तक्षशिला, oh sorry, नालंदा वगैरह। बाकी और कोई मेजर सिग्निफिकेंस नहीं है उसका। ठीक, चलिए देन, थैंक यू फॉर योर टाइम। नेक्स्ट क्लास में मिलते हैं।